Perhaps the weakness in this particular diagram is that we don't have that explosive shape of God, which of course is the only explanation of how Joshua brings this new land under the control of this rough band of Israelites. And that's what makes this very different kind of history. It's not just the historical happenings, it's the God with us that makes it possible for the promises that have been given to Abraham, because that's where it all starts. You see that little timeline down there, part of it, starting at 1900 with Abraham, and it was to Abraham in Genesis 12 that the promise was made that he would be the father of a people, and that God would lead them and bring them to their land. Well, it's been a long time coming, hasn't it? Is it 700 years or so previously that God had said that to Abraham? He built a people. That was the whole thing about the Egyptian years, was to build a people, because Abraham, well, he was a nomad. He was out with his flocks in semi-barren land, but very successful. And we remember that Lot had to separate from Abraham because there wasn't enough forage for both of them to have their animals. Well, how could God ever have built a nation out of Abraham with nomadic peoples? They would have always been separate. Egypt, in the 400 years in Egypt, were a necessity to build a people. Then Moses is sent to bring them out of Egypt, and then their disobedience keeps them 40 years in the desert. But this, too, was part of God's plan. He needed tough people. They were going to face large city-states in the land that God was going to give them. Now, it's also true that in God's historic time, Egypt and the Hittite kingdoms that had controlled Israel, the land of Israel, were in a decline. They were fairly weak. So they didn't have the Egyptians or the Hittites to oppose them. And the city-states themselves appear not to have been as strong as they had been once. All which is nothing Joshua did, nothing Moses did. It's who is behind all this. It is Almighty God fulfilling the promises to Abraham. And so, at this point, Moses has died and been buried by God, it says, and Joshua is poised with these Israelite soldiers on the east side of the Jordan, about to begin to take the land that God has promised them. And there's no way that this can ever happen without the hand of God. And we see, and many times in the account, the sun stands still. Does that mean that we could see a history somewhere in some kind of history of the firmament of the heavens, that there actually was a time when the sun paused? Well, there are some who think so. However, if you look carefully, it's poetic. It means that they accomplished so much in that 24 hours that it was the sun standing still that allowed them to do it. All is credited to God, who is not even depicted on this diagram, sadly. But the Israelite soldier has been disciplined through his tough years in the desert. He's committed, and he is now faced with a ban, with Haram, if he exceeds the law, or if he takes what is banned from any of these exploits. He is not to touch a thing. And the first failure is at Ai because Achan steals the raiment or the gold or whatever it was that he saw was just too much for him. And the Lord will not bless that enterprise that day. They failed, and like Moses, Joshua has to fall on his face and beg God to be with them. If God is not with them, they will never succeed. And then it's revealed that this is because of infidelity to the band. They were also deceived by Gibeon, if you recall that rather humorous story, where the Gibeonites pretended to be from a far country. They didn't acknowledge that they had a large city of their own there. And Joshua made a pact with them without drawing Urim and Thummim. It was a mistake. He learned that he must always request from the Lord his next move through Urim and Thummim. Those were the two lots that were drawn from the priest to determine God's will. So God is the center of this. There is an interesting thing here that Joshua's name, actually, that's the Hebrew for Jesus. And if we think about the meaning of Moses and Joshua, that Moses can't cross the Jordan into the promised land, Moses is the epitome of the law. Obey the law and you will be blessed. Break the law and you will be cursed. Moses is the law. The name Joshua or Jesus foretells a time when Jesus is the new Moses, and it is the law of love, and Jesus alone can take us into the promised land. The law cannot. So there's that little hinge on the name Joshua and what it will mean in the future. But at this point, the people are crossing the Jordan similarly to the way they crossed the Red Sea under Moses. And there's a list there of the different ways that Joshua is like Moses. He even has a theophany where an angel of the Lord appears and as a commander of the Lord's forces, and says that the place that Joshua is standing is holy ground, very much like the theophany of Moses at the burning bush. So in many ways, Joshua will be the second Moses. And God even says, I will be with you as I was with Moses. The conquest begins at Jericho with a famous story about the walls tumbling down. Well, archaeological evidence has been a little iffy on that score. Those who dig down into the ruins say that the walls that came tumbling down long before Joshua and the conquest. But then some wise person said, well, that's just, this is the way to explain that. Cities today are reusing old things in order to save money. And Jericho, no, don't doubt, had very ancient walls, but they kept patching them up. And so when they fell down with the tramping of these thousands of people around them every day and the blowing of the trumpets and all of the cataclysm of that, down they fell. But they were old walls to begin with. That makes sense. Then archaeology has also discovered on some of these city sites that Joshua burned to a crisp. A rough, semi-nomadic culture builds on top of the ruins. Doesn't that exactly fit these people who had been out roaming around with their flocks for all those years? They're rough, but they have to have a place, and they settle down on an old city site. So that really kind of sums up what archaeology has been telling us about the conquest. These people are definitely prepared for this. Wandering in the wilderness, they have become very keen about taking care and taking the advantage of whatever is at hand. As we see that northern campaign, actually the 1, 2, 3, 4 there should be reversed. They rely on divine help. It's entirely interwoven in everything that you read in the book of Joshua. Obedience to God is their essential element in order to be successful. We'll see that because of 40 years in the desert, they have not been circumcised, and Joshua will arrange for a mass circumcision in order to keep the Passover and be in obedience to God. Essential to the conquest is obedience to God. And after that, their successful tactics work. They send out, as we would say, for intelligence. They look the scene over before they attack. They use ambush. They use deception. They use spies. We see that in the very first story. They use psychology, and they infiltrate. It's really guerrilla warfare, something that the city-states were not accustomed to. They thought that they would assemble out on the battlefield with their chariots. Well, Joshua hamstrings the horses. Chariots are of no avail. So little by little they take city after city. However, they don't clear out everyone. They see there's much left to be done. But the whole book of Joshua is very much a victory shout for God and His people. That there is much left to be done, they admit. But it isn't very often reminding them of that during these conquest periods. Now down at the Jordan, the 3 tribes who sent their warriors over to help come back to go to the lands that they were allotted on the east side of the Jordan and build a huge altar. This is near the end of the book. And this causes great consternation. What are they doing? Are they setting up their own religion? Are they not now part of the people? Are they setting up a new covenant? It almost brings them to a point of war with their own brethren. But they are calmed down by the assertion of these men. They built that huge altar only to remind both sides of the Jordan that they are one people, worshiping one God. Now, immersed in the middle of all of this is an obedience to Moses, who told them that when they got settled enough, they were to go to Shechem, between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. There you see it in a circle. They were to set up the Ark of the Covenant between those 2 mountains, and from the 2 mountains, the blessings were to be given by 6 tribes, and the curses were to be given from Mount Ebal by 6 tribes, recalling what Moses had taught them about obedience, about the obedience necessary for blessing, and what disobedience would bring as a curse on the people. And this was a time of recovenanting at the altar that was built of rough stones. And at this time, Moses sets up a new stone, plasters it, and puts on it the 10 Commandments. At one point, my husband and I visited at Shechem, and we saw this giant stone that has been there as part of that covenant relationship. That's what everyone there thinks it is. I don't know how it could be anything else, but a very ancient stone still stands there as a remembrance of this event of recovenanting between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Now Moses had instructed them that they were to do this, and you can find that in Deuteronomy 27. But at the same time, it talks about Joshua uniting the sojourner with the homeborn. Well, that's very strange. Who are the sojourners? Aren't they sojourners? No, they are the homeborn. They are Israel. So who are the sojourners? It appears that there are people who are rather outcast, living outside of the cities, called the Abiru. It almost sounds like Hebrew, so there's been speculation that there were tribal-type peoples who were somehow related to the tribes of Abraham. We recall that some of the forefathers, Jacob, had traveled through that area. Just where these people originated is unknown, but they recognized in Joshua and Israel a kind of life that they appreciated. They might have been outcasts, they might have been troublesome to the cities that they lived near, but this group would embrace them, would accept them. This group treated everyone the same. This group actually promised to give lands out. So these strangers, or sojourners, Joshua asks them to take a pledge to put away their gods at the end of Joshua in chapter 24, in order to make a unified people. It wouldn't seem like he would have had to tell the Israelites to put away false gods. I suppose it's possible that they brought some kind of imagery from Egypt, but hardly. No, this was spoken to the Abiru. They were to make themselves pure to belong to Israel. So this is the background for the amazing conquest of Israel.